Really a pleasure to be here, and awesome to be able to talk about shakuhachi to so many young musicians and especially young composers. I'll just say right now, please write more music. That's what I want, and that's what the shakuhachi community wants. We would love to have more music written by you, and if they don't play it, I'll play it. I promise you that. So today, as long as it's possible, I'll preface that. One condition is it has to be possible to play. Now, so I'm really excited to talk to you about shakuhachi, and I'd like to give you some basic things about the instrument, as well as some cool inventions and new things that have been coming up with the shakuhachi, and new approaching, or how we approach technique in a modern era. So this is basically the shakuhachi. It's a very simplistic instrument. It's basically just a tube with 5 holes. So you have 4 on the front and 1 hole in the back. The interesting thing is the actual embouchure and the that's required to play the flute on the opening here is also very simplistic. So it's very similar to how Native American flutes are in the Americas, where they're all rim blown. So it's like blowing over an empty beer bottle and making a sound is actually the same way that we make how we make a sound on the shakuhachi. The tuning of the instrument is also really interesting too, because it's actually tuned to a minor pentatonic scale. A lot of other Eastern wind instruments are tuned to the major pentatonic scale, so it has a little bit of more of a melancholic flavor to it, which fits really nicely with a lot of the traditional Japanese music. So I just want to give you a quick scale of the piece, of the flute, so you can get a feel for the sound. So the shakuhachi originally came from China about 2,000 years ago. It had made its way over from, thank you so much, Martin, for the clap. Appreciate it. my best scale I could give. It originally came from China about 2,000 years ago during the Tang Dynasty. And when it's made its way over to Japan, it was primarily used in an ensemble called gagaku. And gagaku is imperial court music. And it's one of those things that if you heard it, you'd recognize it. You'd be like, I've heard that before somewhere in a video game or in a movie or in an anime especially. And the shakuhachi is very similar too. We'll get to that in a little bit, how we've heard it in a lot of different TV shows and stuff like that. When it was being used in the gagaku ensemble, it actually had a very interesting role. One of the suspected roles of the gagaku in the gagaku ensemble was that it would be as a tuning instrument. So the shakuhachi would be the first note that played, and everybody would adjust to that, which, by the way, I find very ironic, because the shakuhachi is almost never in tune. So I can imagine when everybody's sitting down and they're like, hey, I wonder what shakuhachi note we're going to get today, and everybody's frantically trying to get a tuning. And I'm sure that you've all sat in an orchestra before, and the oboe player plays a note, and you go, it was definitely not an A. So the shakuhachi fell out of fashion, and most likely the reason why it fell out of fashion in the gagaku ensemble was because that the range of the shakuhachi was covered by other instruments, including the shinobue, the komabue, the ryuteki, and other instruments. So then it makes a resurgence in Japan, and sometime in the 1400s or 1500s, and these by these medicine monks called the komoso. And a lot of the history parts of the komoso and a lot of the history parts of the shakuhachi are very, very difficult to talk about, because you can get, if you ask 10 shakuhachi players about the history of shakuhachi, you're going to get 10 different stories about the history of shakuhachi. But what I'd like to say is that there were these monks, they were named komuso, and they were, depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer on what their role was. I've heard everything from undercover Christians to warrior monks to Zen priest to Jodo priest and everything in between. So there is a lot of different speculations and theories about who these people were and what these people did. But what is very clear is the lasting impact of the music. And I can't see anybody who's watching it besides my glorious, beautiful panel here. But out of my beautiful panel, has anybody ever seen the movie The Last Samurai by chance? Okay, so Ryo has seen it. Okay, Piwat's seen it. So in there we have a bunch of sounds that are actually really, really famous that are just that come right from the shakuhachi, and they've almost become like a cliche. So one of those sounds would be something like this. And then, they add a bunch of reverb on it, and then it kind of just drifts off into nowhere, and everybody's like, oh, we are in Japan now. So with 3 notes, the shakuhachi creates the image of Japan. The second effect that is often used a lot in the movies is an effect called muraiki, and then overblowing. And so you might have heard something like, and then the samurais fight. That's the sword battle scene. It's in the middle of night, right? And then you hear that windy sound, and then you hear somebody go, what would they say? Teme nanda, something like that. And then they go and they try to fight or something like that. But what I find really interesting about the shakuhachi, comparatively to all the other instruments in Japan, is specifically the notation. So I'm going to try to do a quick little share screen here of some of the music. Okay, so what's so interesting about this music is a couple things. So thing number 1 about this music, and I'll get my handy dandy pen. I feel like I'm back in my lesson room teaching right now. Is the first thing that we notice is that we have no time signature in the beginning. So there's no 4/4, there's no 3/4, there's no 2/4, none of that stuff that would help us know, hey, you're going to be starting on this beat and ending on this beat. The second thing that we don't get anything of is we don't get any expressive markings throughout the piece. There's just nothing. So that tells me that, okay, maybe I have to just find my own expressions. Okay, fair enough. Then the third thing that we're not given in the music is any articulations. Well, then I'm like, okay, what are we actually being given here? What are we actually being given? And what we're being given here is tablature. This first note right here is called tsu. And what this tsu tells me is basically you're going to be doing this fingering. And it's kind of written like a Western grace note that goes to a re. So then I know, okay, I have a tsu to a re. I have 2 different fingerings right next to each other. But everything else in the piece is up to you to figure out. And so what I think I like about this as a Western classical musician is that it reminds me of playing Bach. And not from like the manuscript scores that are edited, like the original scores where it's just a bunch of notes and there's nothing. There, all you get are notes and then your freedom to try to express this music. So in a piece like this, what's also interesting about these notes is that they don't just refer to the fingerings, but also to the sound of the shakuhachi. So when I play a ro, right, a ro is the lowest note on the shakuhachi, and it's all the holes covered. When I say ro, the o sound is actually the sound that the shakuhachi should be giving. And then when I play tsu, I get u, the u sound. It's a little bit tighter. And then the next note, le, it should be a little bit more brighter and open in sound. Then chi is e, it has an even brighter sound. And then brighter and brighter and brighter all the way up into the top of the flute. So when we learn our music, we actually sing it as if we were doing Western solfege. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. But ro, tsu, re, chi, ri, i. So this opening of this piece starts on a tsure. So how we would play this is tsure re. So now let's put it over to the shakuhachi. And so on and so forth. So we've already set up a very unique style. Now that's not to say that the shakuhachi can't do other types of music either. So this one type of music that I just finished playing is called honkyoku, and that's primarily the music that would be played in a temple by these monks. And it is said that this was part of a practice of just meditation. There's a modern word that we use called suizen, and maybe a lot of the Western wind playing students have probably heard that term before, suizen, or blowing zen. But that's actually a modern term, and we have no record of it prior to the 1920s. So outside of this temple music, we can also play folk music. So something like Aki no Sato. And I have a shamisen player watching me, so that's really, really frustrating because they are like the minyo kings and queens. So anytime a shakuhachi player comes in and says, I know this song, well, do you really know it? Now, the minyo I absolutely love. I have a big minyo book that I go through and play, and I absolutely, actually, I love playing with shamisen players. I just wish they wouldn't play so loud because then I don't have to push so hard, but they're incredible. And another type of music that we do, and this is where I want to focus the most of my talk on, is the contemporary music. So as a composer myself and having a degree in composition, but not really writing that much, ironically, is that I just love contemporary music and I love all the weird sounds that are possible. So the shakuhachi already has built into its traditional music a lot of really interesting contemporary-like sounds. For example, something like the muraiki effect, which means bellowing the note. And so these types of sound really pique the interest of a lot of composers because Western flute players are told, don't play like that. Don't add air into that. You want the note to be clear and pure and warm. But the shakuhachi will say, that's a great note, but you also want everything in between to make the most nastiest sound, because that nasty sound is also just as beautiful as the so-called warm, beautiful tone. Some of the other effects that are really well known for the shakuhachi are something like the koro effect. And so the koro effect actually comes from when you have two different pieces of bamboo that are in the forest growing, and a gust of wind comes by, and then you get the koro, and so on. But there are other versions of that. So it doesn't stop there. So we have a more airy version called horo. Then we also have another version called uhagoro. And this is a specific technique that was designed in the 1700s for a piece called Ichigo Reibo, which is supposed to mimic the sound of a dragon underneath the water. But again, it doesn't end there, because with the contemporary music, one of the things composers love to do is push the envelope for what an instrument can do and what an instrument can't do. So one of the things that I've come up with are a couple of interesting effects. So one of the main things that we can do on the shakuhachi that I don't think a lot of composers necessarily realize is how many different multiphonics we actually have. So multiphonics are, of course, playing multiple notes at the same time. And so on and so forth. In addition with that, we can also sing and play at the same time. And whatnot, and change and doing harmonies. One of my projects was to do Amazing Grace and try to harmonize with myself. It didn't work. I have to keep practicing way more. So I can't do it today, but maybe in the future I can show you how to do that. Another thing that I also love doing, especially when I talk with kids about shakuhachi, is I love showing them how to do beatboxing with shakuhachi too. So one of the things I do is I take a song that they know. So here's a famous tune. So this is Kutsu ga Naru, famous children's song. Now you just add the backbeat to it. And so on and so forth. And then you have to break away and you give them hip hop. Then you can add the backbeat for yourself and add some bass to it. And so on and so forth, and give them a little bit of jazz, a little bit of hip-hop, and a little bit of something else, to showcase that the shakuhachi is not limited to any sort of genre of music, nor to any sort of technical limitation. I brought out a couple other flutes as well because I want to show you guys some of the differences between some of the flutes that we have. So we have flutes of antiquity and flutes of modern. So the flute that I have in my left hand, might look like my right to you, I'm not sure. This is an Edo period flute. So this particular flute is actually 300 years old, and it has a very, very different sound to the modern shakuhachi. So I'll play that opening of that Honshirabe line again one time with a little bit of extra flair, and then I'll play it on the same exact thing on the old flute. Same thing, just 300 years in the past. Now the question becomes, why is the sound so different from then to now? And the reason is for two primary reasons. One, if you look at the actual size of the flute, it's become much, much thicker. Both the walls of the flute and, of course, the actual thickness of the flute. Another thing, too, are the size of the holes. The holes being a lot smaller means that there's not going to be as much sound that's going to be able to come from the holes. So the only hole that you get from is from the bottom, which is also much, much smaller than the modern flute. But it doesn't end there. We also have what I call, it's actually my new toy, and I call it the tank. So if you look at it, my new flute is like almost double the size of my primary 1.8. So this is actually called a 3.0. And with these longer flutes, you get a much, of course, deeper sound and lower sound. And you can see how much thicker the 3.0 is than the other flute, in addition to just the sheer length of it. Now, flutes like this require a lot more of a stretch, and I should do more yoga in order to play it. Otherwise, I'm going to hurt myself. But this, the flute sound is really, really intoxicating. Of course, there's limitations, just like there is on Western bass flute or Western alto flute. Not so much alto flute, but definitely the Western bass flute, where we're not going to be able to move as quickly or be able to be as agile. And with a lot of the music that we play on shakuhachi, a lot of it tends to be on the more meditative sound side, longer phrases, more about the color of the note rather than more of the how many notes we can fit into a measure. A couple other cool effects that I just want to show you about the shakuhachi is the fact that it has 4 distinct voices. So we have this thing called shomyo in Japanese, which is called or in Japan rather, which originates from India. And the music from that was transferred through India was actually Buddhist liturgical music. And so I'll show you what a score of this stuff looks like. And the first thing that I noticed about this music, and I hope it's clear enough. I don't know if I could become like, if you guys could pin me or whatnot, whoever's streaming, but the music here actually looks very, very similar to the shakuhachi music. And in multiple ways, the only thing that's different is instead of giving us a tablature, note, like tsude, uro tsude chi di ro, it gives us the character in which we're going to sing. So if we look at the opening here of the first characters, we have nyo rai ke do. Now, is the rhythm to this piece? Not necessarily. It's all intuitive rhythm. So listen to how the sound of it is of this piece sung, and listen to how some of the similarities are in the shakuhachi music. Nyo rai ke do ko to o e te shalalim ju ni kakure shi ni. And so on and so forth. You can see how a lot of the even styles of the shomyo singing, of re-articulation of notes, are also within the style of the shakuhachi. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, was the style of minyo singing. And in minyo singing, they have, and I definitely cannot minyo sing, so don't expect me to do that. But some of the styles that they do with turning in the voice. Mimic the same sort of style of the minyo singing. And in addition to that, we also have other sort of more operatic sort of style, bel canto style singing that is possible. But the most interesting part is the singing that happens naturally in nature. So one of my favorite sounds is the crane sound that we make on the shakuhachi. So a crane is called tsuru in Japanese, and one of the most famous shakuhachi pieces is called tsuru no sugomori, which means the nesting cranes. And throughout this piece, it utilizes the koro koro technique, which I showed before, and a technique called tamane, which is flutter tonguing. So the technique that we end up getting is and if you've ever heard a crane before, when they actually, like a red-crowned crane, when they do the sounds, it actually has that sort of flutter-tongued sound, and it's really, really beautiful the way that they do that. So to end it off, what I'd like to do is just play one piece for you live, and then I would like to open it up for some questions as well. So let me just pull this up. And actually what I'll do is I think I'll play that piece that I just mentioned, which is the nesting cranes. Okay, so here we go, nesting cranes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so I try to give a little bit more time because I wanted to have more time to answer questions. And there's always somebody who really thinks, "Can you play the Naruto theme?" So it's already out of the way. You don't have to ask. I can play the Naruto theme. So, questions and about shakuhachi and anything pertaining to shakuhachi.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Sean.
Yes.
So, if anyone has any questions, please unmute.
I'm sure.
Yes.
First of all, that's amazing, Sean. Like, thank you very much for sharing to us. Um,
Absolutely.
my my question was about somehow like we like as a composer, we
Mm-hmm.
always like fighting with traditional um sense. Like we try to find something that beyond um the traditional sense
Yes.
and try to find the development of the Japanese or like even me like Thai traditional instrument or like the conception. So what is your idea about the beyondness? Like something that you feel like I mean, of course you're such a great player, and also like I have to look up your website, like you share a lot of like fundamentals and also like a lot of like information. So what what is the next step for you, like in your
Mm.
thoughts, like how would you feel that the Japanese traditional music could be beyond the boundaries, like beyond the like the current
Yeah,
situation?
that's a great question, and I spend a lot of time in a practice room by myself. You're actually in my practice room right now. It's also where I teach, but I spend a lot of time specifically just trying to come up with new techniques. So some of the techniques that I've done, and then I share it to composers, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm using that." So here's one example. So that's what I call like the dragon's roar, or the lion's roar, and it's just that it's a. I don't share how I can do it because I want to be the only person to do it for a while until someone else figures it out. But like it's techniques like that where it I don't think it actually pulls away from Japanese tradition whatsoever. Yes, it's an unorthodox way of playing. However, we're still talking about nature. It's still something that it's an animal of like, roaring, or you can, whether you want it to be mythological and make it the dragon's roar or the lion's roar, it doesn't matter. But it still has some sort of root connection with the tradition of Japan. Or even something like what I do now a lot of is I do a lot of throat singing and mixing that with the instrument. So I've done things like where you buzz inside the flute, but if you mix that at the same time with singing, then you can get that perfect fourth. Now it sounds a little bit more like a horai. Now if I do it with the Tuvan throat singing, it's just that sound. Then I can get that, and then roll the tongue or buzz and do the same sound. Same sort of thing. You get kind of like the drone like effects of maybe like a chromatone, I think is what it's called, that instrument that's just two pitches or one pitches, that are working across a bunch of strings. So when I'm taking that, it's actually drawing inspiration from other instruments within the culture, as well as what do I hear in nature. So even like the sound that was invented in like I think the 1700s with the, it's actually an unorthodox technique that you don't find in most of the music. However, it's something to nature. So anything that can relate to nature or the culture, even loosely, I think is more than should be more than just embraced, but it should be welcomed into the new body of music.
Oh, that's great. So I mean, something that like an idea from now is like, I mean, you have like your own cultural background, right? And
Yeah.
like once you learn, I can see that the development of the techniques that you use is also like come from Western side. So it's kind of like combination, like multiphonics, like like
Sure.
kind of like frog singing or like something. I can see. I mean, in a positive way, I feel like it's a kind of like combination, like between like different like thoughts, right?
Hmm.
And also like the good thing is that it move like the create more like a kind of new instrumental development.
Hmm.
So would you say a little bit more about the culture itself, like how would this like innovation in terms of like Shakuhachi technique would contribute to Japanese culture itself? So like sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a very difficult question too, and I think that this becomes actually like how I see it. So I could be completely wrong about this, but I do see in the Shakuhachi world like a Kanto versus Kansai, and in the Kanto world, that's Tokyo and Chiba, and which is a lot of pop music and a lot of contemporary music and a lot of jazz. Where in the Kansai area, I see a lot of sankyoku, which is the traditional court music, and honkyoku players. Not to say that there aren't both in both areas. It's just what I see that's popular, especially the pop music in the Tokyo side or the Kanto side. Where I can see some of these innovations happening is that it actually can bridge between the two of them. So where we both share on techniques, if the modern side could use more of the traditional techniques and more of the traditional side, then I think the traditional side would be more interested in coming over there, and then they would be more interested in coming over there because they're grabbing from their own tradition rather than just playing. And it's actually one of my big things that I try to pick on with people, which is if they sound like a Western flute player, why not just play a Western flute?
Wow, thank you.
Um,
So, any more questions?
Yeah, deal.
Hey, thank you so much, Sean, for sharing wonderful stories and playings and the depth of your knowledge and experience with the instrument. And I really appreciate your contribution and your effort and everything that really inspired me to go look back my own cultural roots since I met you during the pandemic. And it's been like such a fantastic journey for me to not only the instrument shakuhachi, but just the Japanese culture, Japanese history, Japanese aestheticism, like everything that you brought me back to my own roots. I think one of the questions, or maybe the things that I'm curious that if you could share some, is that I know you are also very dedicated researcher on the Japanese aestheticism, and then you've already created even like a YouTube content that introduces Japanese aestheticism in sort of a comical way, which was really popular. Maybe and also like in the last lectures that we had, I think the concept of ma, or some of the Japanese aestheticism came up when we talked about Japanese music. Maybe you could sort of share some of the examples of like when or how you would incorporate those Japanese philosophical ideas, traditional philosophical ideas into your playing.
Yeah, Japanese aestheticism is very unique and one of a kind, especially that character Ma. So let me get my little calligraphy pen out here and let me draw the character in question here. So we have the character Ma, which is this character. It's this character here, Ma. Now, what's interesting about this character is that this is what it looks like today. Now, a long time ago, and actually not that long ago, only about 100 years ago, it was actually written differently. It was actually written like this, which is like this instead. Now, it's about 120 years ago it used to be written, and this is the old script. Now, the only difference is this character here in the middle, this is the character for sun. The character on the back here is the character for moon. So a long time ago, what the imagery was, which you'd have like these doors, like here, these shoji doors, and you'd have them, let's see if I can reach all the way back, and you'd have them like this. There are your two gates, and in between you have the moonlight coming through the gate, right, or come through the door. And it's these two massive things are necessary for the beauty that it is. And it's what's amazing about it is that you're actually taking away from the full vision of the moon in order to see only part of it, which is really like a statement of less is more onto a very extreme amount. So how does that work in terms of the music, and what does that mean when we play the music? Okay, well, in any sort of piece of music that we play, there's five steps in every single note that we play, right? Or 5 points to every single phrase. So this is what I'll start with. Now, the first part of it is the conception of it. So we'll put that as a circle, okay? So the conception of the note is right in the beginning, and that's the breath in. So any professional Western musician will also tell you that the music starts as soon as you take your first breath. So that, okay, life has already been made. It's there. That's the life force in. Now, there's a very, very subtle moment that happens here, and we'll mark that with an X. And that X is actually the beginning. Now, notice we're talking about time periods here. So, right, it's all of these gates that are showing us a little sliver of like that beauty, and it's every single moment. So ma is not just silence. It's not just one inter moment. The character itself actually means like time, like an actual time of like you could say jikan, which means it's like the length of time, the length of this thing dying away. And time, toku, actually comes from the word or toki comes from the word tokimasu, which is to dissolve. So things are dying away, and it's the measuring of the things dying away. So this moment right here, this is actually the birth of the note. That's the first sound that comes out. So when I'm closing my mouth to make that sound, there's that little beginning, the first moment of sound. That's the first moment of life. That's the actual birth that's happening of the note. Then we have the sustain. Mark that with a long, right? So this is the life actually being lived. Then after that, we have the sound dying away, going towards death. Then there's the silence, and this is the really crucial part, because this is the mystery. It's the mystery that we all live with, is what happens after death. And that's where that last moment happens, where the sound, for us, we don't hear it anymore. However, we can still feel it. So when I play a note, right, you hear that note in your mind. That there's that da, it's ringing. Now we're just highlighting that by making the note go to absolute nothing, and it almost seems as if we're still playing it, right? It's like in a kind of a lot of old Chinese paintings, you'd see the dragon's tail kind of swirling and swirling off into the distance until it's not, you can't see it anymore. However, you know it's still going. So the entire process, when you're creating the phrasing, phrase by phrase, which is ma, and this is only one example of ma, is like so. And that note doesn't end until the next breath. But when you highlight all 5 points so clearly, the time taken necessary becomes, you're putting in all those pillars to highlight the beauty of that moonlight that's coming through in the music. Now you do that with all the phrases. You have multiple iterations of life happening, right? This is a lot of the idea of what is that called, samsara. You die, you birth and death and birth and death and birth and death, cycle and cycle on for infinity, with this idea, creating these pillars to highlight the moon. So that would be a very, very quick example of how I take some of the ideas of aestheticism from the Japanese traditional culture and then put it into the music